She publicly humiliated the humblest man at the ball, and years later it was that very same man who saved her and her two little girls from starvation and the rain that seemed to have no end. Can you imagine knocking on the door of someone you once wounded with cruel words and asking for shelter, knowing that every drop falling on your face reminds you of the sin you committed? But this actually happened on March 12, 1881, in the rural hills of Georgia, in the settlement of Willow Creek, when the scent of the harvest still lingered in the air, even beneath a heavy, leaden sky. Before we continue this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button down below, because the ending will move you in a way you never imagined. What she discovered on that farm changed not only her destiny, but that of an entire community. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from, because it brings us such joy to know how far our stories travel. The rain fell heavy, as if the sky had collapsed all at once, hammering against the shingles of the village's simple houses and turning the red clay road into deep ruts and puddles. Eleanor Andrews was walking with her sandals in her hand, her feet cold and muddied, losing feeling with every step, a thin, soaked shawl clinging to her back, and her daughters clinging to her as if their little arms could hold up the world. Clara, 5 years old, gripped the fabric of her mother's skirt, breathing hard against the humid air, while Julie, 3, sobbed a cry that no longer had tears, just the raspy sound of a child tired of asking. The metallic taste of forced courage mixed with the taste of dirty water dripping past her lips. The wind carried the smell of wet earth, trampled grass, and distant smoke from a wood stove that seemed to belong to another life. In the cloth bag that had once been beautiful, there was only a piece of stale bread wrapped in a rag and 3 small coins, counted over and over in the dark of the previous night. A few cents that wouldn't buy more than a handful of flour. On that same road, 2.5 years earlier, she had passed in a rented carriage, wearing a pale silk dress, scented gloves, and hair pinned in a tight bun that refused to yield to the breeze. She remembered the glow of the lanterns at the harvest ball and the sweet smell of tobacco curing in the barns. She remembered the man who approached with a small bouquet of wild dogwood flowers picked nearby, large hands, clean but marked by work in the knuckles, and a low voice asking permission to speak. Vincent Albright had looked into her eyes when he said he admired her, that he thought her a woman of strength, that he wanted to offer a future by his side. She remembered the circle of faces, the music pausing slightly, her friends leaning in so as not to miss a thing. She remembered smiling sideways, that smile she had learned since girlhood among the debutantes of the big city, and she remembered the words she chose to wound with precision. She had said she would never marry a man with dirt under his fingernails, that new money doesn't wash away one's origins, and that a little farm didn't make anyone a gentleman. They laughed. They laughed loud. They laughed long. And he walked away without saying another word, taking the flowers with him like someone gathering hope that had found no soil to grow in. Now, in the damp present of March 1881, Eleanor squeezed Clara's hand and felt the girl shiver. She said they were almost there, that soon they would see the large fence with thick posts and the heavy gate of Providence Farm. The word farm weighed differently on her tongue now, heavier than the fate the rain was pushing her toward. Her heart beat to a rhythm she could hear inside her ears, a beat that seemed to mix shame and fear with some stubbornness that, without her realizing it, still remained. Every time she thought about turning back, she remembered the unsigned letter, written with a coldness that burned. Robert Andrews, the husband who had promised a life of luxury and comfort, had left with another woman, taking jewelry, papers, credit, and the little money that remained in the house. His handwriting seemed like a dry cut, without a plea for forgiveness, without explanation, without remorse. Along with the letter, the sequence of days came like a silent avalanche, the creditors, The landlord banging on the door demanding months of back rent. The parlour friends crossing the street to avoid greeting her, the whispers in the general store aisle, and finally the eviction order placed in her hand by the town sheriff, stamped and dated for March 10th. She and the girls had slept that night under a borrowed porch that smelled of mould and old wood. At dawn, Eleanor mashed the piece of bread with cold coffee and gave it to her daughters, keeping only a little for herself and the rest of her courage to continue. When she finally sighted the gate of Providence Farm, a spotted cow mooed as if shouting the arrival of strangers. The sound of the nearby creek rose from the woods like insistent music, and roosters crowed, unsure if it was more night than morning. Eleanor's arms ached from holding Julie, and the child's skin was cold in a way that frightens a mother. She knocked with her knuckles on the wet wood, waited. The drops hit her face and ran down to her chin. She knocked again, harder. Then came the sound of hurried steps, boots dragging through the wet ground, a padlock clashing against iron. The gate opened from the inside, with a creak that seemed to prolong the crucial second. The man who appeared was wearing a worn cap, a seasoned foreman she vaguely recognized from other occasions as Old Silas. He looked at the whole scene with one eye, the other narrowing with the automatic suspicion of one who protects his workplace. She said she needed to speak to the owner. Her voice came out low and hoarse. He asked who wanted to speak. She replied with her full name, and saw recognition pass over the foreman's face, first astonishment, then a shadow of whatever history he knew. Old Silas told her to wait a moment, left the gate ajar, and ran inside. The time felt heavy again, and Eleanor's head spun between the urge to flee and the urge to collapse right there. Vincent's face appeared in the gap a few seconds later, looking like someone who comes when the rain calls. He wore no hat, and water ran from his beard to his neck, streaking his tanned skin with shining paths. There was no smile, no scolding, nor any spoken memory of what had happened in the ballroom. There was a pair of dark brown eyes that measured the child in Eleanor's arms, and the one clutching her skirt, eyes that seemed to weigh the children more than the past. Eleanor felt her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth before she managed to ask. She said she had nowhere to go, that there was no longer a house, that the landlord had put the street inside her living room. She said she had made too many mistakes to ask for anything other than a dry corner for one night. The words came out stumbling, but they all came out, which in itself was a novelty in her life. Vincent nodded slightly as if listening to the rain. He told them to come in. He told old Silas to take the girls to the kitchen, that Miss Rose would warm up some milk with coffee and make some corn chowder. He told Eleanor she could take off her shawl, that he would get her some dry clothes. His voice had the firmness of someone who gives orders every day, without harshness, without exaggerated kindness. The wooden hallway smelled of lye soap and freshly brewed coffee. The kitchen was large and warm, with the wood stove spitting heat in a wave that seemed to embrace anyone who entered. Miss Rose, a woman with white hair pinned in a simple bun and a gaze that knew how to weigh people with half a look, grumbled before she acted. She grumbled that the world turns and that when it turns, it knocks down those who mocked. But while she grumbled, she brought mugs, filled them with hot milk, coffee and sugar, placed them before the girls, and waited for life to return to their faces first, before looking at Eleanor. Eleanor sat on a chair that creaked like old timber as it received the weight of an entire life. Her hands shook as she brought the mug to Julie's lips. The steam rose, smelling of ancient comfort, and the girls drank with small noises that reminded her of nesting birds. Their skin flushed from the inside in a way only a mother notices. Eleanor only drank after the two had finished, and the liquid seemed to find a place in her chest that had been hollow. She heard Miss Rose say, without looking directly at her, that a clean bed would be prepared in the tenant quarters and that dry clothes were already set aside. She heard one last sentence, spoken in a way that mixed warning and judgment. No one here lived for free. In the early afternoon, when the rain turned to drizzle, and the drizzle turned to a fine mist hanging in the air, Vincent called Eleanor to talk on the porch. He explained that she could stay with her daughters, but she would have to work like everyone else there. He said the farm wasn't a charity house, but neither was it a place to deny bread to a child. He listed, without coldness, the tasks available: washing clothes, tending the vegetable garden, stringing tobacco leaves, helping cook when needed, sweeping the yard. Eleanor nodded at each item, like someone receiving small blows that no longer hurt. She said she would do everything with her own hands. She didn't mention that those hands only knew the softness of embroidery and the polish of piano keys. She didn't mention that the first blister opened at the washboard would burn like regret. That night, Eleanor lay on a simple but clean mattress and heard the house creak in every pore. The room smelled of dry pine, washed linen, and a snuffed candle. The girls fell asleep quickly, defeated by a tiredness that allows no argument. Eleanor lay with her eyes open for a time she couldn't measure, recalling pieces of her life before, like someone reading a book that has been torn apart. She remembered her father, Samuel Andrews, a man of soft speech and merchant hands, who had taught her that the family name is the only asset you cannot pawn. She remembered the day he died, a year before Robert ran off, and how the house felt filled with a void no money could occupy. She remembered Robert with the charm that sells promises like a fairground peddler, with the smile that won people over without saying anything, and with eyes that never promised to stay when the tide turned. She remembered the note and the silence. When sleep came, it wasn't rest. It was the blackout of someone collapsing. The first dawn at Providence Farm arrived with the song of birds and the rhythmic lowing of cows in the barn. The air smelled of damp grass and leather, fresh coffee rising from the cloth strainer, and cornbread browning slowly in the wood stove oven. Eleanor woke with a sensation that felt like shame and gratitude at the same time, a new feeling that hurt and healed. She put on the calico dress Miss Rose had left on a bench, felt the roughness of the fabric against her skin, and pinned her hair in a simple bun with a comb that had missing teeth. For the first time since leaving her city home, she rolled up her sleeves to her elbows without worrying about appearance. She went down to the yard, with the girls running behind her, and saw the sun trying to pierce the mist that covered the fields like a sheet. Miss Rose was waiting for her by the large washing trough. The trough smelled of wood ash and homemade soap, a smell that sticks to the hand and the memory. The cold water bit Eleanor's fingers, and she felt her skin scream in surprise. She scrubbed the first sheet until her arm muscles burned, turned it, scrubbed, wrung it out, and hung it on the line that sang a high-pitched squeak with every movement. The first blister opened before mid-morning, and a thread of blood mixed with the water and washed away through a crack in the stone floor, as if the farm accepted the tribute of change. Miss Rose watched her sideways, hand on her hip, mouth twisted in a near smile that betrayed neither sympathy nor antipathy, just experience. She said that for someone who only knew piano and embroidery, she wasn't doing too bad. Eleanor replied with a dry, "Thank you," without lifting her chin. The kitchen asked for help later, and she chopped onions with eyes stinging from things that weren't just onions, stirred pots with the care of someone stirring a destiny that was beginning to thicken, and brewed coffee in a rhythm that felt like prayer. On the third day, the stories started arriving from outside like wind through a crack. 2 women from the village, who had relatives working on another farm, passed by the gate under the pretext of selling eggs, and let slip, intentionally loose, phrases they carried like thorns. They said that in the village, people were saying Eleanor had found a new protector, this time one with dirty hands, and that she was very comfortable for someone thrown into the street. They said that Mrs. Eudora Thatcher, the wealthy widow who commanded half the conversations in Willow Creek, had said it was indecent that a married woman living on a widower's farm was a matter for the sheriff. Miss Rose shooed the two away without rudeness, but without kindness either. Eleanor heard it all with her head down and felt her face burn. The next afternoon she went to the farm's small chapel alone and looked at the simple wooden cross on the wall. She said, voiceless, that she needed humility to endure and strength not to run away. On Sunday, the village church received the entire farm for the service. The nave smelled of melted wax, old wood, and cheap perfume. Mrs. Eudora Thatcher was in the front pew, wearing a dark dress, a hat with feathers, and a fan that opened with a speed reminiscent of a striking snake. When the service ended, she came to speak to Vincent with the smoothness of a swamp. She said it was beautiful to see a man so generous with the needs of his neighbor, and asked if he didn't think generosity sometimes needed to be accompanied by prudence. The words had the varnish of politeness, but highlighted a poison everyone felt. Without raising his tone, Vincent replied that no one needs to fear what is clean, and that in his house there was work and respect, not gossip. Eleanor saw in the eyes of some present a mixture of curiosity and a desire to see her fall. She kept her eyes on the floorboards. That same night, upon returning to the farm, Eleanor was in the hallway when she heard Vincent's voice coming from the study. The door was ajar, and Reverend Davis had gone in to bring a religious book for Miss Rose. The conversation wasn't meant for anyone to hear, but the house was silent, and the words ran to where she stood like water downhill. Vincent said he hadn't done it for her, but for the man who had taught him what true honor is, the kind that doesn't need to be seen. The Reverend replied that gratitude well used is a tree that gives shade beyond its trunk, and that God sees what is done in secret. Eleanor stood motionless. The phrase stood up inside her like someone arriving without knocking. Which man was this? What did he have to do with her? Her brain tried to pull names from the past, like someone pulling clothes from a trunk and finding a forgotten scent. Her heart, in turn, tightened at the thought of her father, Samuel, who always had a way of doing good in silence, but whose magnitude she perhaps had never realized. In the following days, life settled into a thread of order that only exists on a farm. The cattle had hours, the tobacco had stages, the roosters marked invisible clocks, and the sun said when to stop and when to run. Eleanor bent to this clock like someone learning a new language, making mistakes at first and understanding quickly later. In the barn, the strong smell of manure and leather ceased to be an aggression and became part of the scenery. In the garden, the cold earth between her fingers began to promise food. The cold water of the creek that cut through the property, at first an enemy to her skin, became a remedy for overly hot thoughts. The girls, who on the first day were afraid of everything, began to run after the chickens in the yard and laugh as only children laugh, with their whole bodies. Clara learned to make corn-husk dolls with the other children, and Julie grew attached to a spotted kitten that lived around there. At lunch on the 10th day, Eleanor saw a gesture that dismantled her inside in a way she couldn't hide. Miss Rose discreetly placed a larger piece of peach cobbler on the girl's plate, pretending it had fallen there by miscalculation. Eleanor took a deep breath and gave thanks without words. It was also around this time that a small detail lit the first flame of the mystery that already lingered like the smell of rain. While dusting Vincent's study, where a wooden bookshelf held volumes smelling of old paper and leather, a swipe of the cloth knocked a picture frame out of place and revealed, behind it, the corner of a small wooden box. It wasn't anything ostentatious. It looked like a dull crate with simple iron hardware on the clasp, the kind of object that, were it not for being hidden, would go unnoticed. Eleanor put the frame back and left the box as it was, but her mind took the box with it. The memory of the conversation between Vincent and the Reverend whispered behind her eyes, and the word honor kept pacing the corridor between her ears. In the late afternoon of March 21st, Mrs. Eudora Thatcher appeared at the farm in a carriage pulled by two horses, a light cape over her dress and her fan opening and closing to the rhythm of her step. She walked through the yard as if she owned the ground and commented loudly on how the harvest that year seemed promising, although the weather was undecided. She stopped in front of Eleanor with a smile that had ice beneath it. She said it was lovely to see someone of such a good family, knowing how to wash clothes with such dexterity in so few days. The phrase came wrapped as a compliment and was offered as an insult. Eleanor breathed and replied that work was the most dignified thing she had to offer her daughters, and that she saw no shame in soap and water. Eudora's face contracted into a grimace she tried to hide. She then turned to Vincent, who was watching from a distance, and asked, this time without the varnish, if he thought it prudent to keep a married woman under his roof, risking the community's morals. Vincent, with the voice of someone holding hot iron without trembling, stated that he worried about justice before worrying about gossip, and that he wasn't alone in this conviction. There were workers who nodded in silence, and there were also eyes that looked away so as not to complicate friendship with powerful people. That night, the house had the buzz of a hornet's nest in the air. Eleanor bathed the girls with warm water heated on the stove, smelled the soap mix with clean hair, and pressed linens. She tucked the two in and sat on the edge of the bed, watching the shadows of the oil lamp move on the wall, as if they were people who arrived late and didn't want to enter. She thought about leaving. With the little she had, perhaps she could reach a neighboring town, find work washing clothes as a freelancer, and at least take the weight of her name off the back of the one sheltering her. The memory of the box behind the frame came with the memory of Vincent's phrase about the man of silent honor. The desire to know and the need to cause no further damage fought inside her like two stubborn sisters. In the early hours, when the farm slept and the wind blew out and relit the wick of the hallway lamp with a mischievous breath, Eleanor let the door creak as little as possible and walked to the study. She opened it slowly so the strong smell of waxed wood and old ink wouldn't escape with a bang. The lamp in her hand drew small circles on the floor and climbed the spines of the books, which looked like sleeping animals stacked on shelves. Eleanor rested the flame against the wall for a moment, enough to see the frame holding a portrait of a horse and a man, smiling slightly. She removed the frame, and there was the box, exactly as her thought had kept it. She ran her hand over the lid and felt the dust stick to the lines of her skin, a line of new life over old life. The clasp had no padlock. Her fingertips trembled like the tip of a fishing rod when it feels a fish on the hook. She breathed again, this time slower, and opened it. Inside, there were bundles of letters tied with ribbon darkened by time. The smell that came out was of paper stored for decades, with that touch of light mold and memory of ink. The first bundle had dates from 1856 written on the folded corner of each envelope, and a doctor's name she had heard before, Dr. Franklin. The handwriting on the first envelope made Eleanor's heart jump in recognition, a kind of fright that is memory and longing at the same time. It was her father's handwriting. She didn't open it, not at that hour. She closed the lid, squeezed her eyes shut until she saw sparks, breathed like someone just coming up from underwater, and put everything back in place. She left the study with the lamp held higher than before, as if the flame were too small for so much new darkness. The next day, the rumors rose like a flood hitting a valley. A young man working at the general store of Mr. Andrews, her father's old partner, told anyone who would listen that Mrs. Eudora had sworn she would remove Eleanor from that farm, even if it meant a sheriff's order. Another said he heard Vincent was losing tobacco buyers because no one wanted to upset the widow. A third swore he had seen Eleanor and Vincent talking on the veranda, and that due to the wind he heard nothing, but their hands seemed to speak too closely. When gossip has nothing to say, it invents with the material of wind. Eleanor heard from afar without response. She worked double for herself and because of what they said about her. When evening fell, Clara came running with her corn husk doll in hand and said Reverend Davis was arriving. The Reverend brought a bag of vegetables from his garden and a thick book to lend to Miss Rose. He sat on the porch bench and accepted a coffee. He spoke with Vincent in a corner, and then spoke with Eleanor without preaching. He said that nothing escapes one who looks calmly, and that she needed to look at herself as someone looking at a young plant, with patience and water of the right measure. At night, lying with the girls, breathing softly, Eleanor went over what she had seen in the box, like someone passing rosary beads through their fingers. The recognition of her father's handwriting had the force of a summer flash flood. He, who had always been discreet, who preferred silence to a trumpet, had written to Dr. Franklin in that year when she was a girl and thought the world fit in her backyard. What did those letters say? How much did she not know when she thought she knew everything? Her hand tensed over her belly empty of warm food, and her mind lit a thread of decision. Tomorrow, with no one around, she would read at least one. But tomorrow brought new tactics from the outside world. Very early, the dust of the road rose before the sun truly warmed, and a buggy stopped at the gate. The message came from someone who didn't sign with ink, but with the habit of commanding. An employee of Mrs. Eudora's house brought words that didn't hide behind politeness. It was a formal invitation for Eleanor to appear at the widow's house for a conversation about propriety. Vincent listened, thanked the messenger, and said it wasn't necessary. The messenger smiled crookedly and suggested the sheriff would be notified of any disobedience. The atmosphere changed color like when the sky turns from blue to lead suddenly. The workers began to speak lower. Miss Rose pressed her lips into a line. Eleanor felt her stomach turn, like in the old days, but now the nausea was accompanied by a firm twinge in her back. That twinge people call, when they find the name, grit. At dusk, the Reverend returned, without his collar, in a simple shirt, pretending it was a casual visit. He asked to pray with Eleanor and the girls, and when they finished, he said that Vincent's words about the man of silent honor were true as a straight line. He also said that storms of pride always make noise before losing strength. 2 days later, with the sun bursting white on the tobacco leaves and crickets singing in the tall grass, Eleanor returned to the study and this time opened one of the letters. Her father's handwriting began with a contained thanks, almost dry in its discretion, to the doctor who had attended to Mrs. Albright and mentioned as a common fact the sending of $500 in 2 installments, asking only for secrecy because good done without a trumpet tends to last longer. The next letter said the lady had improved from the fever and that the boy, Vincent, had returned to smiling in the yard. Eleanor read with her breath cut into pieces, as if each line were a step too high. She returned the letters to their place with the reverence of someone guarding a relic. The whole world made a noise that wasn't of pots, nor rain, nor beast. It was the sound of pieces fitting together in silence. Now, the phrase she heard that night had a name, a face, and a date. The man of silent honor was her father. And it was for him that Vincent had opened the gate without asking. She left the study with legs lighter than when she entered, but with a heart heavy with a debt that cannot be paid with coin. The shame of the past changed quality inside her. It stopped being just pain and became the raw material of change. She wanted to run to Vincent and say she understood, that she was grateful, that she was sorry for everything, including what she said at that old party. She didn't find him in the house. She went down to the barn and saw him from afar, helping a calf nurse for the first time, firm hands holding the trembling life. She didn't speak at that minute. She saved it for the night when words can sit down and look into eyes. Before the night settled, The gate creaked again. A rider brought, instead of string, a will for trouble. It was one of the administrators who usually negotiated for Mrs. Eudora at the county market. He brought a note informing, in terms of accounting disguised as morality, that some coffee buyers would stop negotiating Providence Farms' crop as long as the case of that woman wasn't resolved. Vincent read with the face of someone reading rain, announced in a clear sky. He said he appreciated the frankness, that he wasn't a man to bend the knee to a crooked shout, and that the farm would fulfill contracts with whoever wished to fulfill them. The man laughed shortly out of the corner of his mouth, turned around and left raising useless dust. When the sky was already heavy velvet with points of light, Eleanor finally spoke to Vincent in the yard, under the smell of coffee, drifting from the kitchen, and wild dogwood carried by the wind from the orchard. She said she had found the letters from 1856, that she had recognized her father's handwriting, that she understood for whom and for what the gate had opened that rainy morning. She said she didn't know how to thank him, because one doesn't thank a bridge that rises the exact instant the river swallows you. She asked for forgiveness for who she was, for what she said, and for what she didn't see. Vincent listened without interrupting. Then he replied that a debt of the heart isn't paid with words or favors. He said he had done what was right to close a circle a good man had opened in silence when he was still a boy. He said the rest, what is done from there on, defines the weight of who we are. Eleanor returned to the room with the girls already asleep and lay on the mattress that smelled of clothes beaten on the washboard. She looked at the ceiling and saw in it the grain of the wood as if they were map paths. She thought that little by little, without realizing it, she was learning to walk on streets that weren't made of stone, but of duty. Distant thunder answered a lightning bolt that wasn't seen, and the night promised rain again. She closed her eyes, holding Clara's hand on one side and Julie's on the other. Sleep arrived like someone known. Early in the morning, when the sky was still grey and the roosters tested their voices, the news came before coffee. A boy from the village, quick tongue and wide eyes, brought from memory a message that claimed not to be a message, but was a warning. Mrs. Eudora would be coming personally to the farm that very day to deal with the matter with the authority she thought she had. The boy barely finished, and Miss Rose was already with her apron in hand, giving orders that mixed cooking and prudence. The air in the house became dense, smelling of coffee and waiting. Eleanor felt the old urge to run, opening a door inside her chest. But something else, which had been born in the study on the night of the letters, commanded her to stay. The entire farm seemed to inhale and hold its breath at the same time. When the carriage arrived and the sound of wheels cut the gravel of the path, the afternoon seemed to stop for an instant, as if the light wanted to watch. Eleanor stood in the yard, hands clean of soap but worn from tasks, and waited. Vincent came from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth without haste. The two stood side by side without planning it. The children, warned, stayed with Miss Rose leaning against the doorframe, eyes attentive. Mrs. Eudora stepped down from the vehicle with her fan open, fanning a heat that was perhaps only hers. She looked Eleanor up and down like someone evaluating merchandise, and then rested her eyes on Vincent with a smile that wanted to command. She started talking, making it seem like she spoke softly to shout better. She said the whole town was worried about morals, that good men couldn't be harmed by scenes like that the law would be called if he didn't act. Eleanor felt her heart rise to her throat, and a mountain formed by memories, letters, and rain rose behind her as invisible support. She decided to speak before the wind made her a puppet on a string. She said with a clear voice she herself found strange, that if she were to stay, she would stay for work and dignity, and if she were to leave, she would go with her head held high and the correct gratitude in the right place. She added that she had learned in a few days more about honor there than in a whole life of fine dresses. The word honor cast a shadow on Eudora's face, who didn't like seeing it used by a mouth that, she judged, had lost it. The widow narrowed her fan and asked what a woman who abandoned her husband would have to teach a community. The phrase cracked in the air. Eleanor replied that she hadn't abandoned anyone, that she was the abandoned one, and that the mistake she could claim for herself was that of arrogance when life was generous. She added that many people speak of morals and few speak of gratitude, and that the only authority she recognized that afternoon was that of divided bread and shared roof without humiliation. There was a murmur, the kind of sound that comes out of the mouth when the chest recognizes truth even before the head admits it. Eudora realized that on that ground opinion no longer ran only in the direction she pushed. She promised to return with papers and signatures. She climbed into the carriage without giving a blessing and left raising dust that found no willing lung. When the sound of wheels faded, the afternoon breathed again. Vincent turned to Eleanor and said it didn't end there. She agreed, and not knowing what name to give to what she felt, went to the kitchen to chop cassava for dinner. No, to peel potatoes. The smell of the raw earth invaded her nostrils with an honesty that resembled stone. While the knife glided, she understood that the story that had entered the farm with rain now had roots, letters, and enemies, and also a path. And as strange as it was to admit, she had hope in a place where one day she thought there were only dirty hands. That night, when everything slept and the wind rested, Eleanor turned her eyes to the dark ceiling and repeated to herself the question that since the first drop of rain ate at time. What exactly had her father done in that distant 1856 that linked his life forever to that of a small-handed boy who would become Vincent? The answer was in papers, but what would come next was in her hands. And someone outside, a half-moon hidden behind a cloud, seemed to want to watch closely what this woman would do with the shelter she received from the man she once humbled. Weeks passed since the day Mrs. Eudora's carriage raised dust in the farmyard, leaving behind more threat than wheel tracks in the gravel. In that time, Eleanor's life settled around a rhythm she had never imagined for herself, a beat made of rooster crowing, calf nursing, coffee being stirred in the sieve, and clothes hung on a long line shining white under the southern sun. What once seemed like punishment was gaining the shape of a hard but strangely fair routine, because everything she did with her own hands translated into something visible. Clean sheet, full plate, swept floor, laughing girl. And tired man thanking with a nod. The letters she had found in the office trunk didn't leave her head, even when her body begged for rest. Sometimes, while scrubbing thick shirts in the tank, she saw the lines of her father's handwriting appear in the foam, speaking of $500 sent in silence to save the mother of a boy who, unknowingly, would become the man now sheltering his daughters. At other times, while weeding a kale bed alongside other women, she felt the weight of a gratitude that wasn't just Vincent's toward her father, but that now, in some strange way, also weighed on her shoulders. Eleanor still remembered, with a lump in her throat, the conversation in the yard under the smell of dogwood when she told Vincent she had read the letters. He hadn't gotten angry at her for prying where she shouldn't, which was already a big surprise for someone used to seeing men raise their voices for less. Instead, he had explained simply that he owed his mother's life to that merchant who never asked for anything in return, and that opening the gate on a rainy morning was just putting a final period on a favor that spanned 25 years without fanfare. Since then, every time she thought about leaving to avoid causing more problems, she remembered that leaving like that would dishonor not only the shelter, but also the memory of that ancient gesture. The days began before the sun showed its first streak of light behind the ridges. The rooster barely crowed the first time, and Eleanor was already up, lighting the stove fire with dry twigs and old newspaper leaves, while the smell of freshly ground coffee invaded the still dark kitchen. The iron head of the pestle hit the grain in a rhythm that seemed like a heart beating on wood, and her arms got used to the weight of rising and falling firmly. Then came the milking of the cows, which she accompanied more closely now, helping to bring the buckets, feeling the white foam bump against the rim and splash on her skin with a good warmth. Eleanor began to realize that the farm was a whole organism, alive, in which each part depended on the other. If the rain fell too much, the drying yard turned to mud. If it didn't fall, the plantation suffered. If someone got sick, a task went ownerless, and a piece of the day needed to be patched by another arm. In the middle of this fabric of people and beast, she began to find a place that had nothing to do with surname, but with effort. The kitchen women, who at first treated her with a mix of curiosity and resentment, started calling her to talk between one cornbread and another, asking what life in the big city was like, laughing at the stories of dresses and balls, and giving advice on how to get grease stains out of ranch hand trousers. Still, none of the small daily victories erased the shadow coming from the village. Rumor is like smoke from a dry grass fire. It lights up fast, spreads everywhere, and when you think it's over, you discover an ember stayed lit under some leaf. The news that Eleanor remained on the farm, and that Vincent did not yield to Mrs. Eudora's pressures, ran through mouths in the water pump line, at the store door, on the church benches after the service. Some said it was proof of true charity, others murmured it was the stubbornness of a man who thought himself above others' morals, and a few, more malicious, preferred to paint the story with colours that had never existed. Vincent began to feel in his pocket what he already felt in his ear. A salt supplier for the cattle, who for years sold to Providence Farm on credit, sent a message saying that, unfortunately, he could no longer maintain those advantageous conditions. Because the situation in the village was delicate, and it was better not to displease certain people. A small buyer, who always appeared at harvest time, was seen closing a deal with Mrs. Eudora's administrators, and, days later, sent word that, this year, he wouldn't be able to negotiate with Vincent, as he was already committed to the last sack. The pieces of the boycott were beginning to fit together in a dangerous way. Eleanor noticed it first in small things. She noted that Miss Rose was doing sums in a low voice, like someone trying to stretch flour for 2 more days. She saw that the bar soap was cut into smaller pieces, that coffee was measured with more care, that leftovers were repurposed with a creativity she admired and feared. One night, she found Vincent sitting at the kitchen table, alone, with a notebook open in front of him, drawing columns and numbers by lamplight, the pen held by fingers used to holding a hoe. She approached slowly, like someone approaching a frightened animal, and asked if she could help with anything. Vincent told her he had learned the basics of numbers with his father and then with practice, but that adding, subtracting, and multiplying didn't make the weight of uncertainty disappear. He said the village rumors were starting to knock on the gate in the form of overdue bills and absent buyers. Eleanor, who had been raised amidst her father's accounting books and knew by heart the sound of a ledger page turning, asked permission, sat down, and began to look at the numbers with attention. In a few hours, she pointed out paths Vincent hadn't yet considered. She suggested provisionally cutting some less urgent expense, renegotiating deadlines with those not in Eudora's hands, and thinking about selling a small part of the production directly in the village, in smaller fractions, to families, even if it meant more work. Vincent listened with new respect, no longer just respect for someone who was an educated man's daughter, but for someone who now spoke with hands marked by the same work as his. From that night on, they began to meet more times before that notebook, mixing the smell of fresh coffee with the sound of pencil scratching and pen scribbling alternatives. It was during one of these evenings, when the girls were already asleep and the rest of the house resonated, that Eleanor's dilemma took clear shape. She knew it was her presence there that fueled in part Mrs. Eudora's anger and the silent boycott of some merchants afraid of losing the widow's favours. At the same time, she knew that leaving now would mean letting Vincent fight alone against a problem that, somehow, was tied to her father's name and the letters hidden in the trunk. Between the impulse to flee, to relieve the weight of conscience, and the desire to stay to transform that weight into something useful, she spent sleepless nights discussing with herself as if she were two people. One dawn, when the wind made the windows rattle, Eleanor got out of bed, unable to swallow the lump in her throat anymore. She went to the small, improvised altar they had set up in a corner of the room with a wooden image and a half-burnt candle. She knelt on the cold floor and, not knowing if she was praying or venting, said in a low voice that she didn't want to be the cause of anyone's ruin, but also didn't want to turn her back on the chance to fix, with the new life, what she had ruined with the old one. She asked for a sign, a thread of clarity, anything that would say whether to go or stay. The only sound in response was a stubborn cricket, but inside her an idea began to emerge. Perhaps the secret of the letters wasn't something to keep only between two hearts. The next morning, while peeling potatoes in the kitchen, Eleanor heard Miss Rose comment to another tenant that the Reverend had said something about truth that sets free in Sunday's sermon, and that when a preacher starts hitting the same key too much, it's because something big is coming. That phrase stayed in her head while the potato pieces fell into the water, making a dull sound. She thought that perhaps the truth of what her father had done, of how Vincent had been helped, and of how that ancient gratitude sustained the present, could be the counterpoint to Mrs. Eudora's poisoned narrative. But at the same time, there was in Eleanor an almost childish fear of exposing in the public square something her father had chosen to do in secret. In this inner confusion, the only certainty was her daughter's gaze. Clara, increasingly observant, started asking questions that cut like a sharp knife. She asked why so many people looked askance at them in church, why some mothers pulled their children away when the two girls wanted to play in the churchyard, why a lady had said, low but not low enough, that the child pays for what the mother pulls. Eleanor hugged the two tighter and promised not with words, but with the squeeze, that she would do everything possible for them to grow up knowing the difference between slander and truth. It was then that Reverend Davis himself appeared at the farm on an afternoon of white sky, that kind of brightness that has no well-defined shadow. He arrived on foot, hat in hand, wearing boots worn at the sole, and a countenance of someone carrying a decision. He sat on the porch with Vincent, accepted a strong coffee, and called Eleanor to join them, which wasn't common. He said the situation in the village was escaping reason, that Mrs. Eudora's tongue had become a blade, and that true faith couldn't be used as a pretext for persecution. Carefully, he asked if there was anything more in the story between Eleanor's and Vincent's families that the community ignored. Eleanor cast a quick glance at the farmer, and it was as if the two, without agreeing, understood that the moment of decision had arrived. She told about the letters from 1856, about the $500 sent in secret, about her father's request that the good deed not become a bargaining chip. She also told about Vincent's mother's illness, about the skinny boy who could have been orphaned right there, were it not for the extended hand of a man who never touched on the subject in public. Reverend Davis listened in silence, eyes downcast and hands clasped. When Eleanor finished, he took a deep breath and said that was precisely the kind of truth that could cut, but also heal. He explained that keeping everything secret now, in the face of blatant injustice, could be seen no longer as humility, but as a mission. He then proposed something bold for a small village in 1881, an open meeting in the church after next Sunday's service, where he, as a spiritual authority, would tell the whole story without citing amounts, but making it clear who owed whom, not in money, but in character. The idea made Eleanor's heart race in a mix of relief and dread. She feared her father's memory would be misinterpreted, that someone would say he helped to aggrandize himself, that the letters would be seen as proof of posthumous vanity. But, at the same time, she felt this might be the sign she had asked for, kneeling on the cold floor, the chance to finally put her life, Vincent's and her father's, on the same thread of truth before everyone. Vincent in turn agreed with a serious nod, saying that if that man from 1856 had chosen to serve truth without an audience, it fell to them now to choose to serve justice with the witnesses time had called. That late afternoon, while the sun went down behind the hills, painting the tobacco fields copper, Eleanor walked alone to the creek. The water ran clear over smooth stones, making a sound reminiscent of suppressed laughter. She squatted at the edge, washed her face, let the current carry a little of the weight she felt in her chest. She thought of the young woman she was at the harvest ball, surrounded by easy laughter, and the woman who now knelt before the same people to ask for understanding, not applause. She also thought that the river doesn't keep the water that passes, but is marked by it forever. Inside the house, at that same moment, Miss Rose stirred a large pot of beef stew with potatoes. The savoury smell rose like a promise of a full stomach. The old cook had been watching Eleanor from afar for days, and saw in her a type of change that resembled yeast in bread dough, something that grows inside before appearing in shape. One night, while they washed the dinner dishes together, she decided to break the hard silence she had maintained since the beginning. She said she remembered Samuel Andrews well, Eleanor's father, entering the general store with a firm step, treating the poor the same as the rich, and that only after a long time did she learn, from the mouth of a loose-tongued nurse, that he had paid for expensive treatment for a sick sharecropper's wife without ever letting the beneficiary know. She said that at the time she didn't make the connection with Vincent's family, but hearing the story of the letters now, everything fit. She looked Eleanor well in the eyes and added that, if her father had that kind of nobility, it was impossible that the daughter didn't have at least a morsel, even if buried under much pride. The words fell into the sink along with the soapy water, but echoed louder than any clattering plate. In these days of silent preparation for the decisive Sunday, the external threat did not diminish. One of the oldest ranch hands was sought out in the village by an emissary of Mrs. Eudora, who offered a job on the widow's farm with slightly higher pay and the promise of a better house, provided he had sense and left that land where morals were in crisis. The man thought, hesitated, and ended up returning to Providence Farm to talk to Vincent. He said he needed to be honest, that the temptation was great because he had children and a wife, and the table wasn't always plentiful. Vincent replied with the same frankness, saying he wouldn't hold anyone by force, that each one needed to choose the type of boss they wanted to serve and the type of story they wanted their children to tell about them later. The hand stayed quiet for a while, looked at the house, the yard, the trail of Eleanor coming and going with a bucket full of corn, and decided to stay where he was. In the midst of so much tension, it was also necessary to feed the bond with those hearing the story from outside, like you following this narrative. Therefore, in that instant when the farm's heart beat faster, it is worth remembering. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances and the power of gratitude. Stories like Eleanor and Vincent's show that life isn't always fair, but there is always space to choose what to do with the injustice that hits us. Sunday arrived with a sky of almost insolent blue, without a single cloud to justify the storm announced on other plains. The church of Willow Creek began filling with people earlier than usual. There were curious onlookers who never missed a good commotion. There were sincere devotees. There were secret allies of Mrs. Eudora, and also people who, deep down, hoped the truth would come out at once so they could sleep without having to take sides in the dark. Eleanor wore the best she had, which was no longer silk or lace, but a well-washed cotton dress, ironed with care, with a discreet bow at the waist that Clara helped tie. The girls went hand in hand with her, with simple ribbons in their hair and a seriousness in their gaze that didn't match their young age. Vincent waited for them near the gate, mounted on a chestnut horse, tense in a way only those who live off the land recognize, like the air preceding frost. They went together to the village, part of the way on horseback, part on foot, mixed with the workers who, on their own account, decided to go. At the church door, Mrs. Eudora was already installed in a prominent place, fan in hand, dress more luxurious than usual, like someone dressing for a trial of which she considers herself more judge than defendant. When Eleanor passed, she felt the weight of the widow's gaze sliding over her like a knife over orange peel. Some whispers lit up in the pews, but ceased when the bell rang, calling everyone inside. The service proceeded apparently normal, but every word from the reverend, every reading, every hymn seemed loaded with double meaning for those who knew what would come after. At the end of the celebration, when traditionally everyone would stand to leave, Reverend Davis asked them to remain seated a little longer. His voice, usually mild, gained a tone of firmness that surprised even those who had known him for years. He said he was tired of seeing faith used as a weapon of condemnation among neighbors, and that, therefore, he had something important to say in the name of truth and justice. He asked then that Eleanor and Vincent approach the altar. A buzz rose like a swarm of bees. Eleanor walked to the front with heavy legs, feeling the floorboards creak under her steps as if the whole church breathed with her. Vincent accompanied her, hat in hand and face serious. Reverend Davis held a bundle of yellowed papers, tied with a faded ribbon she recognized from afar. She also recognized her own handwriting on the note she had left for the Reverend the day before, authorizing the use of those letters, and felt her heart tighten at the memory of the moment she handed the man in the cassock her father's story to be shared. The Reverend explained to everyone that what is seen doesn't always tell the whole story. He spoke about a time, 25 years ago, when a humble woman from the region had fallen gravely ill and a boy risked losing his mother. He told that, at that time, a cattle merchant, known by everyone in the village, but who never boasted of anything, had paid for expensive treatment in the city, asking the doctor to keep the secret, because he considered doing good an obligation, not a favor. He pointed then carefully to Vincent and said that boy was the man who today ran Providence Farm. Then he turned to Eleanor and said her father's full name, Samuel Andrews, with the reverence reserved for those who have already passed. He told how that silent gesture had changed the course of 2 lives, Vincent's and his mother's, and how the gratitude born from there spanned decades until manifesting without fanfare in the choice to open a gate to shelter a woman and 2 children on a rainy morning. Upon finishing, he asked aloud for the whole church to hear what kind of morality would condemn a man for honoring a debt of the heart so faithfully. The silence that followed was different from all other silences that Nave had ever heard. It wasn't the distracted silence of those waiting for the next prayer, nor the formal silence between one hymn and another. It was a heavy silence of people who had just received a missing piece to understand an old puzzle. Several heads turned almost simultaneously to Mrs. Eudora, as if expecting from her a reaction equal to the noise she had made in previous weeks. The widow, however, wasn't a woman to lower her eyes easily. She stood up with her fan in hand, advanced 2 steps down the central aisle, and, with the voice that used to command half worlds, said that helping the poor gave no one the right to violate the rules of decency. She stated that regardless of old debts, the fact was that a married woman continued living in a widower's house, and that this was enough to scandalize upright people. Her words cut the air, but they no longer had the same weight as before. The story of the letters had changed something invisible on the scale. It was there, in front of everyone, that Eleanor felt she could no longer be just a subject of conversation. She asked the Reverend for permission with a look, and he nodded. With a firm voice, which not even she knew she possessed, she said that if anyone there had the right to speak of shame, that person was she, Eleanor, who one day humiliated an honorable man before the whole village, mocking his humble origin and the work of hands that today fed her. She confessed before everyone that she had been arrogant, cruel, and blind, and that her husband's abandonment and fall from status were, in a way, the bitter harvest of seeds she herself helped plant. She added that, since arriving at the farm in the March rain, she had learned more about dignity washing clothes, planting, caring for animals, and sharing a table with simple folk than in all the balls and salons of her youth. She said that if anyone wanted to see her kneeling, there she was, kneeling not before gossip, but before her own conscience, asking forgiveness not only from Vincent, but from the entire community, for having fed with her past behavior. The idea that wealth of birth made her better than others. The entire church seemed to shrink and grow at the same time with those words. A different murmur ran through the pews, this time loaded not with malice, but with astonishment and, on some faces, reluctant admiration. People used to seeing flimsy excuses and empty justifications saw in that moment a woman assume, without beating around the bush, the piece of guilt that was hers. Even those who didn't like Eleanor felt there was something rare there, the courage to look in the mirror without makeup. Vincent, beside her, kept his gaze firm on the altar, but inside felt a weight lift, as if, by admitting aloud what she was, Eleanor opened space for what she was becoming to finally have a place. Reverend Davis concluded by saying that if, after all, that anyone still wanted to judge, let them judge with the same rigor their own history, asking themselves how many times they had extended a hand without expecting applause. He reminded them that God sees intentions, and that often the cruelest tongue is the one masking itself as zeal for morals. The final benediction fell on heads that didn't quite know if they left there lighter or just full of questions. At the church exit, some approached Eleanor for the first time, without the filter of gossip. A lady who previously crossed the street not to cross paths with her held her hand and said losing a husband wasn't punishment, it was a wound, and that a wound needs clean cloth more than pointing fingers. A man who owed money to Vincent for years and who always avoided the farmer's gaze promised to pay what he could, not because he was afraid, but because he felt ashamed by the comparison. Even two young women who had laughed at the harvest ball years before approached with eyes downcast, saying they remembered that day with increasing discomfort. Mrs. Eudora left stomping hard, surrounded by two nephews carrying her purse and wounded pride. She swore, in a low voice for anyone who wanted to hear, that this wasn't over yet, that no one was going to turn the game around so easily. But even as she spoke, she felt that a part of the strength she exerted over the village had escaped through her fingers, like creek water finding a crack in stone. The eyes that once followed her with obedience began to divide attention with the couple descending the simple church steps, empty-handed, but heads held high. On the way back to the farm, the path seemed different, although the trees were the same, and the dust rose just the same. Clara and Julie walked a little ahead, picking wildflowers and laughing at simple things. Eleanor felt for the first time since the March rain that she didn't carry a mark only of disgrace, but also of courage. Still, she knew the boycott wouldn't disappear overnight, that the tobacco wouldn't sell automatically just because the truth was spoken within 4 sanctified walls. The practical problems remained there, waiting for solutions of the type not solved with a sermon. That same night, arriving at the farm, Vincent gathered the workers in the yard, illuminated by lanterns hanging on hooks. He told, in few words, what had been said in the church for those who couldn't go, and said that, from there on, the farm would move forward with whoever wanted to walk together, without fear of looking anyone in the eye. He spoke of the approaching harvest, of the sales difficulties, and of the need for everyone to unite more than ever. Eleanor, beside him, realized this was the beginning of a new phase, no longer the phase of surprise and pure survival, but that of direct confrontation against a threat that was now known not to be just in gossip, but also in pockets and harvests. As night descended over Providence Farm, with crickets singing and stars appearing one by one in the clear sky, Eleanor lay on the simple mattress and looked at the wooden ceiling. She no longer felt she was just using a borrowed shelter, like someone occupying a place that isn't theirs. For the first time, she began to see herself as part of a story bigger than the shame that brought her there. The story of an ancient gesture of kindness, of a man who chose to thank with a whole life instead of words, and of a woman who, after humiliating, learned to ask for forgiveness and work with her own hands. Sleep came heavy, not from empty tiredness, but from that which is born when, even with fear, we finally choose a side within ourselves. And, outside, the farm breathed with her, as if preparing for the next battle the dawn would bring. The morning after that strange Sunday, when the whole church seemed to breathe along with Eleanor's confession, the sky dawned thick, a grey, not of rain, but of trapped heat. The air was still, as if the world held its breath before a thunderclap, and even the birds took longer than usual to risk their first song. At Providence Farm, however, no one had time to notice the colour of the sky right at the start, because duty called loudly. The tobacco harvest was at the door, the drying barns had to be swept, the storage sheds prepared, the tarps mended. Eleanor woke with her body heavy from fatigue, added to the tension of the last days, but with her soul airier than in a long time. The image of herself kneeling before the community, assuming her guilts and telling for the first time the true story behind Vincent's gratitude, returned like a dream that wasn't a nightmare, even though it had hurt. She remembered the eyes of some people, previously hard, now full of a kind of suspicious respect, like someone who doesn't know if they believe, but feels they can no longer repeat the same evils as before without blushing. While stirring the coffee in the cloth strainer, the strong and familiar smell rising in dark swirls, Eleanor heard hurried steps in the yard and voices louder than normal. She went out to the kitchen door with the dishcloth still in her hand and saw two hands running toward the barn, shouting for Vincent, who was coming from the side of the tobacco fields. Her heart raced without knowing the reason, in an ancient intuition that, after days too calm, it was the storm's turn to collect its due. What followed wasn't exactly a storm, but had the same power of destruction. During the night, someone had cut part of the back pasture fence, through which a dozen heads of cattle had escaped toward the low woods. To top it off, a corner of the tool shed showed signs of a recent fire, scorched wood, strong smell of cold smoke, and a remnant of ember still alive, hidden among ashes, which Miss Rose stomped on with a bucket of water before it gained breath again. It was a clear message, written in fire and wire. This wasn't going to end in words and rumours alone. Vincent organized, without shouting, a small group of men to go look for the stray cattle, while others took charge of repairing the fence and checking the rest of the property. Eleanor, with hands trembling slightly, helped prepare bags with pieces of bread, dried meat, and bottles of water for those going. As if that simple gesture could protect them from something bigger than hunger. The fear she felt wasn't only of the financial loss, which she knew was great, but of where someone's anger could reach when thwarted in front of everyone. At noon, the sun burned without mercy, and the pasture smelled of trampled grass and horse sweat. Little by little, the men returned with part of the recovered cattle, but not all. A younger calf wasn't found, and Eleanor felt the loss as if it were one more piece of the farm torn up by the root. On the porch, while Vincent listened one by one to the reports, there remained no doubt that this hadn't been the work of beast nor carelessness. There were clear marks of tools used to saw the wires and of feet that didn't belong to the household. Miss Rose, with her apron stained with bean broth, murmured that this was the work of people used to commanding without being contradicted. No one needed to say the name, because it already echoed silently in the walls. Mrs. Eudora Thatcher. Since leaving the church with poison choked in her throat, the widow hadn't given a direct sign, but her silence now seemed more dangerous than her speeches from before. If before she used her tongue to whip, now she seemed to use hired hands to attack in the dead of night. That day, after feeding everyone, Eleanor locked herself for a few minutes in the room with her daughters. Clara, perceiving the agitation, asked if the rumor running among the children was true, if the rich woman from the other farm wanted to take the place where they slept away from them. Julie hugged the pillow as if she could hold on to the bed itself. Eleanor replied that sometimes people who are very afraid of losing power do cruel things, but that as long as they fought with truth and work, they wouldn't accept being pushed back into the rain. She also said they wouldn't let anyone's resentment define who they were. Time ran like this, with a strange mixture of normal days and nights of vigil. Some workers took turns in discreet rounds around the barns, the corral, and the curing sheds, with lanterns covered by cloths so as not to attract attention. Eleanor began to sleep with a sharper ear. Any crack of wood or different bark from the yard dog made her sit up in bed with a start. Even so, she insisted on keeping the girls' routine as intact as possible, telling stories before sleep, praying with them, and teaching letters using pieces of charcoal on the back of burlap sacks. It was precisely from these improvised lessons that an idea was born, sketched in her head since the Reverend spoke about light and truth. Seeing Clara's attentive eyes following traces of crooked letters on the cloth, Eleanor thought that if life had been more generous, perhaps she herself would be, at that moment, teaching in a real school and not in a cramped tenant room. The memory of the convent school books, the calligraphy lessons, the grammar, returned not as nostalgia, but as a tool that could be used. For the first time, she seriously considered the possibility of transforming the farm into a place where not only tobacco, but also people could flourish in another way. One night after dinner, she spoke to Vincent about it. Sitting on the porch, listening to the croaking of frogs in the distance and the noise of crickets mixed with the spaced mooing of cows, she told him of her desire to teach not only her daughters, but also the workers' children, to read and write. She said she knew that for now, the most urgent problems were cut fences, extinguished fires, and lost cattle. But she didn't want to let the seed of something bigger die, just when she had learned that true value wasn't in appearances, but in what was left as a legacy. Vincent listened with attention, face half hidden in the shadows, and replied that he had always missed that in his own childhood. He told her he learned to sign his name with an old overseer, who took pity on the curious boy who kept asking what was written on the marks of the coffee sacks, no, tobacco bales. He said that if he had managed to manage with numbers and accounts, it was more out of stubbornness than ease, and that he thought, from the bottom of his chest, that education was wealth no one steals with boycott or knife. He promised then that if they managed to cross this difficult phase, he would help build a simple place, even if it were a room beside the chapel, to be a school. But before any brick was laid, reality made sure to remind them that there were still more immediate debts to be collected. Almost a month after the meeting in the church, when the mood seemed to have calmed a little, the farm received an unexpected visit. The county sheriff, a man with a thick moustache and a gaze mixing tiredness and calculation. He arrived on horseback, accompanied by 2 deputies, bringing with him a paper claiming to be a formal complaint about alleged immoral conduct in that house. Seeing this, Eleanor felt her legs weaken, not out of fear of guilt, because she had already reconciled with her own conscience, but knowing who was certainly behind that paperwork. Vincent received the sheriff in the main parlor, which smelled of waxed wood, fresh coffee, and the light scent of coconut soap Eleanor's cleaning had left on the furniture. With a calm that wasn't weakness, but self-mastery, he offered a chair, coffee, and listened to everything the man had to say. The sheriff explained he needed to investigate the complaint, which spoke of blatant concubinage, of scandal to public morals, and other big expressions that became smaller when they hit the hard ground of truth. He asked to see where Eleanor slept, if there was only one room, or if the house contained separate spaces. Victory and defeat that day began in the space of a threshold. Eleanor, with a hot face from embarrassment, showed the tenant quarters where she and her daughters slept, separated from the main wing where Vincent's room was. The sheriff saw the two small beds, the simple toys scattered on the floor, the small altar with a wooden image and a candle. He ran his hand through his beard, like someone looking for an excuse to complicate what is simple, but didn't find one. Upon returning to the parlor, he looked the farmer in the eyes and said that formally he had nothing to point out there. However, he added in a low voice that the pressure in the village was great, that many people wanted to see disgrace at that door, and that he couldn't guarantee new complaints wouldn't arise. Vincent replied that he expected special protection from no one, but only justice, the same that would apply to any other man in those conditions. He said he knew where the village's moral concerns came from, and that he didn't intend to bow to one person's whim, no matter how much money and influence she had. The sheriff, perhaps touched by the serene firmness, perhaps just attentive to the changes of wind in public opinion after the sermon in church, limited himself to saying he hoped everyone there behaved with discretion, and left the way he came, raising dust and leaving behind a trail of uncertainty, but also of immediate relief. That visit, although threatening in appearance, served to unite even more those living on the farm. Some workers who, until then, had remained neutral began to take sides, offering help in the night watches, bringing news from the village with more goodwill, and reinforcing that Providence Farm wouldn't be alone if the siege tightened. Even people from other properties tired of Mrs. Eudora's maneuvers began to approach in silence, offering when they could a sack of corn, a little salt, a borrowed horse to fetch something in town. Small gestures added up, made the resistance gain body. It was in this atmosphere of tension mixed with solidarity that the harvest season finally arrived. The tobacco fields extended over the hills like a green carpet, the broad leaves ripe and heavy, waiting to be primed. The smell of fresh tobacco, still on the stalk, mixed with warm earth and sweat. It was time to get up even earlier, to sing field songs to chase away fatigue, for calloused fingers to snap leaf by leaf, filling sleds that would be dragged to the barns for curing. Given the labor shortage caused by the silent boycott of those who didn't want to be associated with Vincent, something unexpected happened. Whole families of small homesteaders, who usually harvested only for themselves, appeared offering help in exchange for part of the production. Not just money. They said they preferred to share with someone they knew would treat them with respect than submit to the harsh conditions of Mrs. Eudora's farm. Suddenly, the yard filled with people with new voices, children running between the tobacco sleds, large pots steaming to feed everyone. Eleanor threw herself into that work with a devotion that surprised even herself. In the morning she went up and down the rows, her dress sticking to her legs from so much walking, the kerchief on her head absorbing the sweat running down her forehead. In the afternoon she helped string the tobacco leaves onto sticks, handing them up to the men hanging them in the tall barns. At night she still had breath to cook, mend clothes, and when there was a sliver of time left, teach the children to draw letters in the dirt floor under the weak light of the lanterns. Amidst this rush, the bond between her and Vincent was strengthening, not in romantic speeches, but in small things, in the way he, without realizing, always took the heaviest part of the load when they walked together. In the way he asked, at the end of the day, if the girls were well, if medicine hadn't run out, if Julie still coughed at night. In the comfortable silence that sometimes settled between the two, when they shared the same mug of coffee sitting on the porch steps, looking at the sky full of stars that the south makes bloom as if it were cotton in the field. It was on one of those nights when fatigue felt pleasant, like the weight of a blanket on a cold day, that the threat gained its clearest face. A panting boy arrived from the village, hat in hand and shirt sticking to his body from so much sweat, bringing news that Mrs. Eudora had been infuriated by the farm's resistance. They said she'd lost an important contract with a buyer from the capital because he preferred to negotiate with small producers linked to Vincent, bothered by the way the widow treated the tenants. Ashamed before this refusal, she allegedly slammed the table and swore loudly that she would make that little cattle farmer and his proud protégé regret messing with her. The threat seemed just words thrown in a big house parlor, but Eleanor learned over those months that certain words, in the mouths of people with money, tend to gain arms and legs. She asked the boy for details, wanted to know who heard, who was present, to understand if it was exaggeration from the news-bearer or dangerously real. The answers confirmed, more than she wanted, that there was no invention there. Vincent, listening to everything, stayed silent for a while, looking into the dark of the backyard like someone watching a hidden enemy. Then he said, with that calm that came more from faith than lack of fear, that what needed to be done was what they were already doing. Working right, keeping heads high, reinforcing security, and trusting that at some moment the weight of the error would fall on whoever committed it. The days advanced until a good part of the tobacco was cured, ready to be graded. It was there at that point in the story that the commercial game became most dangerous. One had to find someone to buy, and the buyers linked to Eudora made a point of offering ridiculous prices, hoping to take advantage of the financial pressure. It was then that Providence came by a path no one expected. An old acquaintance of Samuel Andrews, Eleanor's father, who now lived in the bigger city, learned by letter of the farm's situation and the story the Reverend told in church. Moved as much by the memory of his friend as by the courage of the son of the saved sharecropper, he decided to visit Providence Farm. He was a middle-aged man, in a worn but well-cared-for suit, with the attentive eyes of a merchant who had seen it all. His name was Arthur Preston, and he worked as an intermediary for tobacco sales to export houses in the capital. He arrived without much fanfare, but the news spread fast among the workers. There was a buyer on the farm, not just anyone, but someone coming from afar, on the recommendation of someone who had already departed this world. Vincent received him with a firm handshake, and Eleanor, hearing Arthur's name, vaguely remembered her father's conversations years ago about an honest partner with whom he preferred to do business. After inspecting the leaves, examining the color and texture, walking through the barn and listening in detail to what had been happening, Arthur made an offer. It wouldn't be the highest price in history because he also needed to pay for transport, taxes, and save his margin, but it was infinitely fairer than the ridiculous values offered by the middlemen linked to Eudora. More than that, he committed to buying not only that year's crop, but also the next, provided the quality was maintained, giving Vincent a security the farmer hadn't felt in a long time. The news of the negotiation didn't take long to reach the widow's ears. They said that upon learning that a man linked to Samuel's memory had come to support precisely those she tried to topple, Mrs. Eudora had a fit of fury so great she broke, with her own hands, an imported porcelain cup she boasted of so much. It was symbolic, a piece of the life of ostentation she built on control and fear began to crack from the inside. But people like her don't fall without bumping into everything around. On the night following the signing of the agreement with Arthur, when the farm finally breathed relieved to see a near future drawn out, danger showed its most concrete face. It was past midnight when a strange smell of strong smoke, heavier than that of the wood stove, began to invade the hallways. Eleanor was the first to notice. She woke with a start, nose sensing a strange scent, and saw, through the crack in the door, an orange glow where there should be no light. She jumped up, shook Clara and Julie, ordered the two to stay in the corner of the room, kneeling, faces close to the floor to escape the smoke, and ran into the hallway screaming Vincent's name. The fire was coming from near the storage sheds, where the graded tobacco was kept, a structure of dry wood, which was an invitation for flames. In seconds, the whole house was on its feet. Men grabbing buckets, women carrying basins with water, children crying without understanding. Vincent appeared with eyes wide and voice firmer than the moment deserved, ordering 2 human chains to be organized, one from the water pump to the shed, another from the clay pots to the sides where the fire was still crawling. The orange glare made shadows dance on the walls, and the heat was such that it seemed the air wanted to be fire too. Eleanor, without hesitation, grabbed one of the buckets, entered the line, and began passing water hand to hand, feeling her arms burn with fatigue, but refusing to stop. The smell of thick smoke scratched her throat. Tears streamed from her eyes, not only from fear, but from the sting. At some moment someone shouted that the fire was approaching the part where the largest bales were, and that if it reached that, the loss would be incalculable. It was in this instant of despair that the resolve of many began to waver. There were those who thought it wouldn't work, that the fire was bigger, that it was better to save only the people and let the flames eat the rest. Eleanor felt this thought try to nest in her chest too, but something inside her rebelled. She remembered her father facing debts, Vincent as a child almost losing his mother, the promise not to run from consequences anymore. With a voice that didn't sound like hers, she screamed to everyone not to give up, that that crop was the future of everyone there, that if they let the fire win now, they would be handing victory on a platter to those who wanted to see them on their knees. It was a scream that had no authority of any office, but carried the authority of lived truth, and that made a difference. Tired arms gained a few more minutes of strength, buckets continued running hand to hand, and after an eternity that clocks wouldn't know how to measure, the flames began to yield. The wood crackled, but no longer spat tongues of fire so high. The orange glow grew smaller, until transforming into stubborn embers that could be covered with earth and water. When the last focus went out, the silence that fell was broken only by the sound of chests heaving and the stubborn coughing of those who had sipped more smoke than air. In the middle of that defeated chaos, there was a certainty. This hadn't started alone. Someone from outside, once again, had come to bring destruction, betting that at the height of fear, everyone would choose to save only their own skins. But this time the whole farm had responded differently. Vincent, face dirty with soot, looked around and saw, in everyone's exhaustion, a bond that not even the best-made fence could hold. The consciousness that they had fought together for something that wasn't just tobacco, but dignity. And it is precisely at this point where fire was contained by courage and unity that it fits to open a parenthesis with you listening to this narrative. If this story is touching your heart, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and share with those you love. Because there are many people who, like Eleanor and Vincent, need to hear that not every fire manages to destroy what is built on gratitude and truth. The morning after the fire, when the smoke was just a distant smell stuck to clothes and hair, the yard dawned taken by curious and supportive neighbors. Some came to offer help to rebuild what was burned. Others brought important news. Part of Mrs. Eudora's henchman, who used to brag at the tavern after 2 drinks of moonshine, had let slip, amid drunkenness, details about a fire prank that had gone out of control the night before. Names were spoken. Descriptions matched the memory of those who saw figures running near the shed moments before the fire started. Now, finally, there was more than suspicion. There were witnesses. Reverend Davis, upon knowing this, advised Vincent not to take justice into his own hands. He said this was the moment to let the mask fall before the law itself, not to fall into the temptation of returning fire with fire. He encouraged him to gather the statements of those who heard the drunken confessions, to formally register the occurrence and demand an investigation. The sheriff, pressed now not only by the rich, but also by the community's growing indignation, couldn't simply shelve the case. He had to open an inquiry, interrogate the suspects, who, cornered, ended up confessing they had received money and orders from above to scare Providence Farm, without wanting to cause so much damage. The confession fell like a stone in the calm lake of Mrs. Eudora's influence. Even though she tried to deny direct connection, saying she never gave the order for arson, just to give the cattle a scare, the truth now circulated from mouth to mouth with the same speed that calumnies against Eleanor once ran. The difference is that this time, each story came accompanied by the trace of soot people still saw in the hair of those who helped put out the fire. The sheriff, perhaps tired of serving as an instrument to a single will, finally applied some type of punishment. He fined the widow heavily for complicity and ordered her to keep her distance from the farm, under penalty of answering for more crimes. For someone accustomed to commanding without being contradicted, that was a humiliation as great as the one Eleanor once caused Vincent at the harvest ball. The difference is that, while Eleanor transformed shame into a starting point for change, Mrs. Eudora chose to retreat into bitterness. Little by little, people drifted away from her, not out of articulated revenge, but because no one likes, for very long, to be beside someone unmasked as the source of others' misfortune. Conversations at the church door began to happen without her being the center. And loneliness, which she always tried to push onto others, came to sit beside her, silent. At Providence Farm, on the contrary, life followed a rhythm of reconstruction. Part of the burned shed was erected again with the help of the workers themselves, who, in the late afternoons after work, laid bricks, sawed wood, and raised walls to the sound of songs. The school dreamed of by Eleanor began, discreetly, to be born in a corner of the old barn that hadn't been hit, with repurposed boards, simple benches, and a chalkboard improvised with wood darkened by fire. In the beginning, it was just her, a few children, and a handful of old notebooks Arthur sent from the city, along with the tobacco sacks. The days lengthened, and when she realized it, it was no longer just the woman abandoned by her husband who taught, but Miss Eleanor, as they began to call her, with a sweet respect, strangely distant from that Eleanor Andrews full of ribbons and lace from the past. The farm girls learned the letters of their own names. The boys spelled words of things they saw every day: cow, tobacco, river, sky, and little by little, their notion of the world grew beyond the hills that surrounded the view. Vincent, seeing that scene through the window, felt a peace he didn't know, a sense of fulfilled mission that had nothing to do with money, but with meaning. The relationship between him and Eleanor, which until then walked on a delicate line between gratitude, friendship, and respect, began to be crossed by a feeling both recognized, but struggled to name. It wasn't the easy dazzle Eleanor once felt, seeing Robert arriving in a tailored suit and promises of the big city. It was something silent, born of shared routine, of shared gaze over the children, of trust built in mud and smoke, and of the way one completed the other's sentence when it came to deciding the farm's direction. One afternoon, after finishing another class, Eleanor stayed alone in the small improvised room they called school. She ran her hand over the board still dirty with chalk, erasing the last letters of hope, the word she had chosen for that day's lesson. She was smiling alone, remembering Julie's face trying to draw the S backwards when she heard footsteps approaching. Vincent stopped in the doorway, hat in hand, the afternoon sun outlining his silhouette against the light. He looked at the crooked boards, the scratched desks, the poorly made chalkboard, and said he had never seen anything so beautiful on that farm since the day the first calf was born healthy after a sequence of losses. He added that seeing the workers' children learning to write their own names was like seeing a new type of crop growing there, one that didn't depend on rain or market prices. Eleanor, not knowing where to put her hands, replied that she was only giving back a little of what life, despite everything, had given her in the form of study. There was a brief silence, the kind that isn't awkward, but full of unsaid things. Then Vincent, face serious as always, but eyes shining differently, said there was something else that needed to be planted there, and it wasn't tobacco or words. It was a common future. Without beating around the bush, he asked if Eleanor would accept one day, when she felt ready, to be not just a tenant, nor just a teacher, but mistress of the house together with him, in the fullest sense of the word. He didn't speak of marriage as a contract of convenience, but as a partnership of two who had learned, the hard way, the value of walking side by side. Eleanor felt her heart beat out of rhythm, but this time there was no audience or silk dress, nor orange blossoms decorating a hall. There was only her, hands still stained with chalk, and him, nails slightly dirty with earth, in a simple room smelling of wood and chalk dust. She remembered the first time she had humiliated him before everyone, remembered the weight those words had on both their lives, and the distance separating her from that proud girl she was. Looking into Vincent's eyes, she replied yes, she would accept, but she would enter this new life not as the merchant's daughter, nor as the woman once deceived by the city's easy shine, but as the washerwoman, the cook, the teacher, and the mother she had become under that roof. The wedding wasn't a big city party, but a farm gathering full of truth. It happened months later, on a cool morning when the sky seemed to have been washed overnight. The small farm chapel filled with simple people, dresses tidied as much as possible, clean shirts, some field flower arrangements decorating the altar. Clara and Julie, in pale dresses and new ribbons in their hair, walked in front, carrying in their hands not imported bouquets, but sprigs of tobacco with small flowers, a symbol of everything they lived there. Miss Rose cried more than at any party she had seen in her life, wiping her face on her apron and repeating softly that she never imagined gaining a daughter precisely from the one who entered one day, all wet, asking for shelter. After the simple ceremony, celebrated by Reverend Davis with a short homily on forgiveness and new beginnings, the party extended through the yard. There was rice with chicken, fat beans, stuffing, cornbread, coffee brewed in large pots, and even a little moonshine for those who wanted to toast, all prepared by community effort in the kitchen. A banjo player started old tunes, children ran loose, and even an improvised barbecue over a ground fire appeared, smelling of good fat crackling on embers. Eleanor, instead of a luxurious gown, wore a simple white dress, sewn by one of the tenants, and a necklace that had been her mother's, the only object of value left from her past wealth. In her eyes, however, there was a light that no city jewel ever managed to light. Time passed, as it always passes, without asking permission. 3 years after that wedding, the landscape of Providence Farm had changed in a way that would catch the eye even of those who didn't know the story. The barns were standing firmer, the fences reinforced, the fields expanded by a few acres, but the most beautiful change couldn't be measured in acres or dollars. The school, now with whitewashed walls and simple glass windows, lived full of laughter and spelling voices. Some of Eleanor's first students already knew how to read small letters. Others began to risk notes to relatives in other towns, proud of every stroke. Eleanor walked among the desks with a belly growing, announcing the first child she would have with Vincent. She felt the baby move when she explained certain words, as if he also participated in the lessons even before being born. Clara and Julie, now bigger, helped their mother in the school, taking care of the smaller ones, arranging notebooks, explaining with patience how to hold a pencil. They called Vincent father with naturalness and pride, and he answered as if he always had been. In the village, the fame of the school farm began to run. People from other regions came to ask how they had done it, wanting to copy it, even if on a smaller scale. Some old allies of Mrs. Eudora, ashamed of what had come to light about the henchman, sought a way back, trying to do business with Vincent. He, without rancor, accepted to negotiate, but never again bowed to unfair conditions. The farm had learned in that crossing the value of saying no as much as the value of saying yes. As for Mrs. Eudora, she aged, surrounded by her own walls. She still had money and land, it is true, but her big house became increasingly empty of visitors, and her own voice, once so full of authority, began to echo only inside enormous walls without an audience. Sometimes she passed by carriage in front of Providence Farm, but she no longer stepped down, was no longer received as a threat nor as a friend. She just kept going, carrying with her the weight of choices that transformed pride into loneliness. One late afternoon, with Eleanor and Vincent's small son taking his first steps in the yard, the family sat on the porch to rest. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple, while the smell of fresh coffee and leftover cornbread rose, mixed with the soft perfume of dogwood blossoms. From the yard came the familiar sound of workers returning from the fields, tired but satisfied laughter. Eleanor looked around and saw the whole scene as if it were a painting someone hung on the wall of time, the farm alive, the school standing, the children running, Vincent by her side, and her father, from some place she couldn't name, smiling through everything that had been built from a silent gesture so many years ago. She squeezed Vincent's hand and said, with a choked voice, that she would never forget the morning she arrived there, in the rain, with her daughters in her arms and her pride shattered. She said that if someone told her that day, that one day she would be on that porch, surrounded by love, respect and purpose, she would have laughed at the idea as she laughed, unjustly, at him at the harvest ball. Vincent replied that life has a strange way of teaching, sometimes harder than we would like, but that when we accept to learn, even pain becomes a seed. He added that if today he was a better man, it was also because she had the courage to recognize her own mistakes and work to become another. The small boy, stumbling over his own feet, ran to Eleanor's lap, bringing in his hand a tobacco flower he had picked in the yard. He handed it to her as if it were treasure. She took that tiny flower between her fingers and thought of everything it represented: work, fire risk, boycott, fair sale, education, second chance. She kissed her son's forehead and whispered that she wanted him to grow up, knowing that nobility doesn't live in a surname, but in what we do with others' pain and with our own. When night fell completely, and the first stars began to appear, Eleanor stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked at the soft dark covering the fields. She remembered the day she thought her life had ended there, on that same land, when the only thing she possessed was the shame of the past and fear of the future. Now, however, she knew that sometimes one must be torn from a comfortable house to find, in the shack no one wants, the place where the heart truly dwells. And that is how this story closes, not with fireworks or ballroom applause, but with the simple sound of the night in the country. Crickets, frogs, distant lowing, a child laughing, and two tired but peaceful people sitting side by side on a farm porch. There, in the rural South, at the end of the 19th century, where so many believed a woman's destiny was traced only by the man she married, Eleanor proved, with her own life, that it is possible to be reborn after abandonment, humiliation, and loss. With the help of a farmer she once humbled and who chose to offer shelter instead of vengeance, she transformed the site of her greatest sin into the setting of her greatest redemption. And the legacy they left of work, forgiveness, school, and shared bread continued echoing in every child who learned to write their own name on that land, as if every letter were a small prayer of gratitude for the day the door didn't close.